McCuistion for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
You know, marijuana is being legalized for medical and recreational purposes in many states across America, even though the federal government still lists it as a Schedule I drug. On this program, we'll examine medical marijuana, but before we meet the experts, though, I want you to meet my co-host of this program, Katie Carol Whitton. And Katie is an award-winning print, radio, and television journalist, had her own television program about 10 years in Colorado. So, Katie, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And now I'd like to introduce one of our guests. Joining us today is Robert Birnbaum. He's the president of Peartree Trading. He's also the founder and former chairman and CEO of Curaleaf, which is one of 4 licensed medical marijuana producers in Connecticut. He's gone from the white shoe world of J.P. Morgan to the frontiers of medical marijuana. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to be interested to hear about that, Robert. We really are. Sitting next to you is Jacob Sullum. Jacob, I don't know, what, 15 years ago, I'm going to say, Jacob, when you were on this program, I'm guessing? You've been
Something
talking
like that,
about
yeah.
this topic a long time, and so you are a senior editor at Region Magazine, which I know, a nationally syndicated columnist who's been covering drug policy for 30 years, even though you don't look like it. He's the author of Saying Yes in Defense of Drug Use and For Your Own Good, the Anti-Smoking Crusade and the Tyranny of Public Health. And before I ask you the question I'm going to ask you, I'm going to look at video number 3, which has to do with a little man on the street that our producer, Nikki McCuistion, did the other day about a lady who's going to talk about why she thinks medical marijuana is a good idea.
100% it should be legalized, and there's a lot of reasons. The first reason is it was illegal, made illegal based on lies years ago. It's great for your health. It's great for the environment. We have a lot of disproportional people of color that have been locked up for a harmless plant. It rips up communities, it destroys families, it's a waste of our taxpayer money that could be spent on education, housing. All the states that have legalized it already, it's working great. Their schools are strong, they're getting in more taxes. It's the stupidest law we've ever had, and I hope to God it ends soon because there's a lot of innocent people sitting behind bars.
I know of a lot of people who became addicted to marijuana and their lives just went downhill afterwards, and so, yeah, that's my opinion.
I come from a background where most of my family used to do that, and one of the biggest things my dad used to say was that really prevented him from going far in life. Because most people don't tell you about the use of marijuana is that when you use marijuana, it helps you to become lazy. And when you lose that drive to like do things, you become complacent and you lose your sense of purpose. So he said that was the biggest thing why he always felt like he couldn't accomplish things because all he wanted to do was sleep and eat and do nothing. And though his action affected my siblings and myself.
From your perspective, should marijuana be legalized for recreational use?
Well, I'm an economist, and we're almost unanimous in favor of that. Okay, tax it and let the market decide.
Yeah, now, Jacob, they're still over their opinions, of course, but what do you attribute the great shift in sort of the American public toward in favor of this versus where you were almost out there by yourself a few years ago?
Yes, it makes me uncomfortable to be in the majority now, but I think what happened is people became more familiar with this drug. If you look back at the origins of marijuana prohibition, people didn't understand what this was. It was some weird drug that other people used. It was used by Mexicans. It was used by Negro jazz musicians. People didn't even realize that, in fact, it was the same drug, cannabis, that had been used in patent medicines in the 19th century in the United States. And so it was very easy to demonize because it was something that seemed exotic and unfamiliar. And you heard all kinds of stories about how marijuana caused outbursts of irrational violence and horrible crimes and so on.
For madness kind of things,
if you
right?
Look, right, and if you look at the comments that members of Congress made when they were passing the Marijuana Tax Act, which effectively banned it at the federal level, they didn't even know what they were banning. They didn't know what it was. So over time, certainly beginning in the 60s and definitely by the 70s, middle-class white Americans were becoming more and more familiar with this drug, and they discovered that it didn't actually do the things the government had claimed it did. It didn't ruin their lives for the most part. Nothing terrible happened, except if they happened to run afoul of the law. That would be the worst consequence. This is an observation Jimmy Carter made back in the late 70s. The worst consequence associated with marijuana use is getting arrested for it, getting a record for it. And so we're at this point now, if you look at the survey data, where most Americans have tried marijuana. And if they haven't tried it, they are probably familiar with people who have. And so they tend to be more skeptical about the old-fashioned warnings. And more comfortable with this thing that used to seem so exotic and threatening. I think that is the main factor. It's become normal, really, certainly among younger Americans born after World War II, to at least try this drug and to have some experience with it.
So Jacob, you said it's become more normal. It's more normalized, more accepted. But what is the single greatest argument to legalizing marijuana?
Well, from my perspective,
your perspective.
Yes, the strong. Who else would I be offering? From my perspective, the most important argument against prohibition is that it's not just to punish people for doing things that violate no one's rights. So if you are growing marijuana or using marijuana or selling marijuana, you are not violating anybody else's rights by doing that. So it's not just to arrest you and put you in jail for it. The corollary of that, I guess, is that people have a right to control their own bodies and what goes into their bodies, which is a premise that I think most Americans endorse in at least some areas of life, right? I would like to see that applied more consistently, so that people are recognized as being sovereign over their own minds and bodies, as John Stuart Mill put it, and that you don't interfere with that unless somebody does something that actually violates another person's rights.
Okay, well, that's a compelling case that you've made. Now, Robert, to you, you've got a very interesting story. You've made a huge career shift. Would you give us a sense of the how and why you've gone from your past life to your current forays into medical marijuana?
Yeah, thank you. So I spent almost 3 decades in the investment management business on Wall Street with very conservative firms. And it wasn't that I hadn't ever seen marijuana while I was in college, but I was clearly in a very different world. But when I retired from Wall Street and was just sort of doing some of my own trading, on Labor Day weekend of 2013 was an article in our local town newspaper about how Connecticut was going to start accepting applicants to be in the medical marijuana business, to get a license. Now, Connecticut had already decriminalized possession, but now they're going to set up a medical marijuana system. And I knew nothing about this. Got on the internet, of course, did tons of research, and it seemed like, first, a very interesting business opportunity. One of the most striking things, these are all hangovers of the prohibition that Jacob has described so well, is that unlike a normal business, you couldn't get financing for this business. So it was going to require people who had money to come into that business. So if that was the case, could I find people who had money who wanted to be into it, but maybe you could make a better return because you had to have your own. So it seemed like an interesting business opportunity. And of course, we also thought it was just a weed. How hard could this business be, right? It's just a weed. It turns out to be a tremendously difficult and demanding business to be in. So there were lots of surprises along the way.
Was that the biggest surprise, or were there other surprises along the way?
Well, there were a lot of surprises. A lot of them do come out of this prohibition. But the first one is that marijuana itself is a complex plant to grow. It doesn't grow easily, it requires a great deal of care, particularly in a controlled environment, which is what you want for the medical side of things. You need to grow without pesticides. You need to grow in a mold-free environment. So you're really ending up with a pure plant. That's difficult and demanding, and people get crop failures all the time. The other side is that this federal prohibition on marijuana influences almost every aspect of the business in ways which are, sort of completely unexpected. One way is banking, right? Let alone a loan, just trying to get a checking account is incredibly difficult. Patients can't get insurance reimbursement, for their medication. And states set up an entirely parallel universe to deal with medical marijuana because of the federal prohibition. So medical marijuana can't be sold in pharmacies because a pharmacy will lose its DEA license if they sell marijuana. So states have to set up dispensaries. doctors can't prescribe marijuana because they would lose their licenses. So doctors issue a diagnosis, and the patient then goes and gets a license. It's a parallel universe that impacts almost every aspect of the business.
It's actually an incredibly complex issue, and I want to take a look at graphic number 9. We'll go over some of the definitions of the marijuana industry. First up, we've got CBD, which is short for cannabidiol, and that comes from the hemp or marijuana plant. Where a given product comes from depends on the legal status of marijuana in a particular state. If medical marijuana is illegal in any given state, THC levels determine whether a CBD product is illicit or not. In most places, the limit is extremely low, under 1%, with some states opting for a cap as low as 0.3% THC. Now let's take slide number 10, and we'll get to THC, the biggie. THC is short for tetrahydrocannabinol, and it's one of at least 113 cannabinoids identified in cannabis. THC is the principal psychoactive constituent of cannabis. And finally, let's go to graphic number 11. Cannabis sativa, also known as hemp, is a series of the Cannabinaceae family of plants. Cannabis is also known as ganja, grass, hashish, hemp, Indian hemp, marijuana, pot, reefer, weed, and a plethora of other terms. But cannabis contains the chemical compound THC, which is also known as delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and it is the main ingredients, the psychoactive ingredients in cannabis.
Yeah, and I want you guys to know this, and I want that viewer to know this too. You think I have her up here just because she's smart? No, it's because she could pronounce those names, so that's the reason.
I had a little help from my friend.
It took me a few months to get them right also, and I was in the business, so it took a while.
I had some help.
But it's very complicated, and this question of the source complicates things for consumers, for patients even more.
Yes, which leads me to another question, quality. Robert, how do we know what we're getting? I mean, how do we know in terms of purity, efficacy, safety?
Right. So if I could step back for just a moment, because there's two separate regulatory regimes which make things very difficult. So up here, as you said, you've got the cannabis family. Cannabis has been cultivated for 10,000 years already, and different varieties of cannabis have been cultivated for different characteristics. So hemp is a variety which has been cultivated mainly for its fibers, some for its seeds. Marijuana and its varieties have been cultivated to have high levels of THC in it. So, but they're all part of the same family of plants. The marijuana, because it's federally illegal, is the one that's regulated on a state level. Your state may have it legal for medical purposes and/or adult use purposes. If you're in a state that has a regulated system, you can have a high degree of confidence if you're buying it through the regulated system that you're getting what you're supposed to be getting. They're tested independently, they're labeled properly, and you have a high degree of confidence. But if you're buying it from the hemp side, you've got a whole different set of issues.
All right, so you believe in the regulatory thing is important. Now, Jacob, let's say you knew a lot about marijuana before this thing became legal. It was just what you read, am I right?
Sure.
Okay. No, just checking.
And of course you didn't inhale.
Of course.
Well, this is actually sort of comical. This is a hangover from when this used to be a very touchy question. You may notice that Kamala Harris took a lot of credit for being so honest about her marijuana use, but this is something, she's about my age. It's quite typical for somebody who, of our age, to have tried marijuana in high school and college. More people have than haven't. So it's really not that controversial to admit that anymore, as long as you say it was a long time ago, right? So I think a lot of that stigma is gone now.
Well, but the quality issue that we were just talking about, I mean, that person watching this program before all of this stuff sort of got legal in many places, had to buy this stuff off the street. I mean, what's going to happen now? I mean, are we still going to get stuff smuggled in from Mexico and other places? I mean, what's all this illegal stuff going to look like, or is it going to be better now, better quality, something we can appreciate, or what?
Yes, I think one of the big benefits of legalization, aside from no longer arresting people for marijuana use, is that you get more reliable information about what you're buying, right? So in the states where it's legal, you will have percentages of CBD and THC in a given product. Now with the raw plant matter, there's a range there. It's not exactly precise, but with edibles and with extracts that you're vaping, you know how much THC is in a given volume, and you can dose yourself accordingly. So that's a big advantage. Whereas, especially with edibles, because this is something that could be very, highly variable in the black market. It is helpful to know that if you take this square, that's going to be about 10 milligrams of THC. And then you can judge accordingly how much you want to take. So that's a big benefit. Another big benefit, of course, is that you can limit that legal market to adults. It's something you cannot do in the case of the black market.
The big question,
Yes.
the $64 million question. Okay, I know that it can be regulated, but how do we keep it out of the hands of our youth?
The short answer is you don't, because you can never keep it completely out of their hand. But as I said, there's no, black market dealers do not card people. If you have been to Colorado or California or Washington, they're very serious about verifying that buyers are 21 or older.
I mean,
so you cannot, it's much harder to get it directly from a retailer than it would be in the black market. The one factor I would say that people, advocates of legalization often don't acknowledge is that there nevertheless may be increased leakage from the legal adult market. Just as there is from the legal adult market for alcohol, you might get an older brother to buy beer for you. You might get an older brother to buy pot for you as well. Right. And I left it, to me it was an open question as to whether legalization would be followed by an increase in underage use. And I'm sort of surprised that it hasn't been. Because if you look at the data from Colorado and Washington, which are the states that have had legal marijuana the longest, there hasn't been an increase in teenage use. There's been an increase in adult use, especially young adult use, but you haven't seen it. Now, that may change in the future, we don't know, but we know that the only way of having any kind of control is to have a legal market.
All right, well, along those lines, do you think that it could be a gateway drug?
Well, that issue, remains controversial. This is a theme that was being pushed by Harry Anslinger. After he stopped saying that marijuana turned people into murderers, he started saying it turned them into heroin addicts. And that's been a persistent theme in anti-pot propaganda. There very clearly is a correlation between use of marijuana and use of other drugs. The question is, what does that association mean? Is it a causal relationship? And if it's a causal relationship, in what sense? Right. So just for example, to show you how complicated it can be in terms of the policy implications, suppose that it's true that people who use marijuana are more likely to use other drugs because of that experience. Mm-hmm. Now, it could be the reason that happens is that they have to go to the black market to get marijuana, and they're therefore familiar with people who may have access to other drugs as well, and so they have an entry point they might not otherwise have had. It could be they try marijuana and they realize that the government has been lying about it, and they think, well, maybe meth isn't so bad and maybe heroin isn't so bad, and that it reduces that inhibition. And it could be that they just get used to breaking the law. Yeah. And they've broken one drug law, why not another?
Not others?
Now, all three of those things would suggest that you could actually make the association weaker by legalizing marijuana, because all of those are contingent on prohibition, right? The real question is whether there's something about, pharmacologically about the experience of using marijuana that somehow makes you more likely to try other drugs. And I'm skeptical of that notion. It's certainly never been shown. I'm not sure that it can be shown. You can't do a controlled experiment. It's not considered ethical to do that, to divide babies into two groups and expose one to marijuana and the other one not, and to see what happens after 20 or 30 years. So probably we'll never have a definitive answer to that question. But I think, there's clearly an association, and it's just a question of interpretation as to what that association means.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of behavior, though, we do know that there are some things that are observable. For instance, driving and traffic. Are there more traffic accidents because of people being permitted to smoke marijuana?
So far, it does not look that way.
Really?
In Washington and Oregon. Now, the things that they will emphasize, what by they I mean the prohibitionists, people who oppose legalization, will say the percentage of, for example, percentage of drivers in fatal crashes who test positive for marijuana has gone up. That's true.
It has gone up.
Yes, but that does not mean, the fact that you test positive for marijuana does not mean you were impaired at the time of the crash. It does not mean you were under influence at the time of the crash, or that marijuana had anything to do with the crash. So if you have a general increase in consumption, which we are seeing, you would expect that the percentage of drivers who test positive would also go up.
You're rationalizing
but what
this,
you want,
Jacob. You
what,
know
what you
you're
want to know
rationalizing
is,
this.
you want to know, does the total number of fatalities, is it higher than you would otherwise expect? And the answer is no. So far it is not. So and there's also another complication is that because marijuana has a much less dramatic effect on driving ability than alcohol does, potentially you could actually improve road safety by legalizing.
So get high and drive safe?
No, to the extent that people, instead of being drunk, are high, neither is a good idea, but being drunk and driving is much more dangerous. So if there is a substitution effect, and there's some evidence from states that have legalized medical marijuana that there is a substitution effect, and that you actually see a decline in traffic fatalities associated with liberalizing the rules around marijuana.
Okay, now forget the health stuff. Let's talk about important stuff, Robert. Let's talk about money.
The money?
Okay? Money. Follow the money here.
Okay.
How much money? I keep reading stuff like $75 billion industry or something. Are we likely to see big players like the tobacco firms, all this, end up where we only have 4 or 5 people, or is it 9 million, penny stocks these days that are selling stuff? I mean, you're the financial guru.
So at the moment, it's more the latter than the former. There are no real giants. There are obviously bigger players than others, but there are no real giants. But eventually that will change because, it's the benefit of size, of scale, means cost of production goes down. And so if you're able to then sell the product for less, you tend to sell more of it and you get bigger. So that is going to happen. For that to happen in the United States, you have to have interstate commerce for that to work. So it's going to require some federal action, which will eventually happen, but we're probably some years away. Whether it's the big alcohol and tobacco companies that come and dominate, I think is a completely open question. Tobacco companies, certainly are seeing their businesses decline. They're interested in getting into this business, and you see them making investments.
They bought Juul as an example.
Yes, which is obviously not a marijuana company, but they're investing in marijuana companies in Canada, where it's illegal for them to do so, as perhaps a way out. But then they become a marijuana company? Maybe it ends up being like the beer industry, where you've got large producers and you have craft producers. So there's lots of ways that this could go. It is a big business, and when you put hemp together with it, and fortunes will be made, but it's still very early days.
So if you were to advise somebody who wanted to get into this business, what would you suggest they do? Let's say I want to start my own pot business.
Yeah, she's from Colorado already. She's already halfway there.
Yeah. So that's a good point. I put it, the way the business has evolved now, you sort of have to put it in context and say, well, what if I wanted to get into the beer business? What do I need to know? Well, you sit back and you say, well, you actually need to know a lot of things, right? You need to know the regulations. You need to have capital because you need to be able to produce. You need to know how to make it. You need to have a strategy for your products. You need to have all of those things. And marijuana, the other thing you have to have at this stage of development is you have to have a cultural affinity, because of this level of prohibition that Jacob has described so well, a whole marijuana culture, subculture developed on the other side of the law, and most of the knowledge of how to actually produce marijuana, how to make the products, how to do all those things are from people who are on the other, wonderful people. But it's its own culture, and you have to have an affinity for that too.
Okay, we just have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to play this other man on the street thing. It might make your case. I don't know. Let's look at video number 5, please.
Absolutely. No, it's great for medicinal purposes. As a matter of fact, there was a study done in the late 30s by Mayor LaGuardia in New York, and I know it's been on your program before, where he put marijuana at the hospitals in New York to see if it would help the patient's pain, and it did. Amazing study. The government didn't like that, so they came and picked it all up and burned it in New York City, and it became a regulated bad thing. It's good stuff. CBD is already approved in Texas for epilepsy. If you can help epileptic kids with a product from marijuana, CBD, hello, it's good.
Been more of a lifestyle for us growing up here in Hawaii, it being so available and our older generation being so proud of the cultivation that it provides for them. So it was so much easier to have, and it wasn't necessarily you're doing the wrong thing. Maybe the ages that our friends chose to do it was the wrong thing, but it was never really you're doing wrong. So when it finally became medical in our state, everybody looked at it a lot differently. A lot of people looked at it better more than worse than finally. And I feel that it being medical now serves a way better purpose than hiding it.
Okay, this is such a fascinating topic. I could talk to you, I'm sure we could talk to you for hours, but if you had one word to describe the marijuana legalization situation today, what would it be? Jacob.
Freedom.
Okay. Robert.
Complicated.
I thought you were going to say money.
Yeah, no, it's complicated.
Okay.
But advocate for your state to have a legalized, regulated system. It's the best thing that you can do.
Medical first, at least?
Medical first,
Okay,
and then
for
adult
sure.
use second.
Well, thank you both for being here, and Katie, thank you for joining me as well. You know, as you've just heard and seen, marijuana is a topical and mind-altering subject today. So you won't want to miss our next program on the pros and cons of legalization. Until then, check McCuistionTV.com, follow us on Twitter, and stay healthy. As always, we've been talking about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.mccuistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.